Hello everyone, welcome back to another Final Fantasy TCG deck profile with me, Chocobilly. And this week I'm looking at a little deck I made called the Vanguard, although really it should be focused more on Kefka, probably. So you can tell pretty early on what the gist of this deck is. So Fire Earth, lacking any summons or monsters completely, but it does use a lot of forwards. So the idea behind the deck is killing your own forwards through a multitude of different means, but then utilising a couple of cards in the deck to be able to basically bring them back or capitalise on the character's deaths. So the 8 CP Kefka is really the idea behind the deck, but that comboed with the likes of Xande. So when Xande enters the field, you choose as many forwards as characters have left the field that your opponent controls, and you deal them each 9k. So say for example I use Kefka, or pay for Kefka, by putting 3 forwards I control into the break zone. I then play Xande onto the field. I can deal 3 loads of 9k to different 3 forwards. And that's not to mention the fact that Kefka had come in and broken a forward then as well. So you can deal with a wide board fairly quickly with this deck. But there are other couple of weird little ways that I have utilised cards in this deck that actually also capitalise on Kefka, putting them into the break zone as well. But I'm going to start with the backups first, and then I will move on to the forwards. So first up, I've got something like Lael, just a standard decent wind card, Earth card, that just handles a lot of commonly played summons. So Amaterasu and Mist Dragon are 2 of the big worries here. Also kind of the Leviathan as well. Actually no, just definitely the Leviathan that cancels, so Amaterasu Leviathan. Being able to stop those from being a threat is very important, so having Lael there is, yeah, worth it. Kuchaspel, just because if you are up against a deck which stops any damage dealing, it means cards like Nail, Squall, and Xande aren't just going to end up fizzling. You can have Kuchaspel actually making sure the damage is dealt. Claris, so this is your consistency searcher, and it's an EX as well, which is always nice. So Claris can search you, Edgar, so you can find your fire backup through that as well. Kolka as well, so it makes sure that even if you've already got your earth backups down, you can play Claris and get another backup, and Kolka is also a nice way to hopefully be able to kill something. I think that's all of the king forwards, but then there's also a few king forwards as well, king backups as well, I meant earlier. So Regis is one of the kings in the forwards. Where are the other ones? There's a lot of forwards here. Muraga Fens as well, so he's also a king. And EX, he's not the best card in this deck, but I'll explain more about why he's in the deck later. I think that is it for the kings. But yeah, he's got a lot of search targets basically, so that kind of justifies his 3 of, and he's also an EX as well, so you can get you a lot of cards to hand. Geomancer, just making sure you can push that point of damage. Also nice to have a backup that can break itself if you do need to play something like Kolka to then break or whatever. Noctis, so there are 2 Noctis. He has a fair few forwards that you can play onto the field, but there is one particular one, and that's obviously Regis. So being able to, the combo is you put 3 forwards into the break zone to play Kefka, you then break Noctis to play Regis onto the field, which then plays 2 of the forwards that Kefka put into the break zone. If one of those forwards was Xande, then you also get to deal 4 packets of, actually no, you get to deal 5 packets of 9k. So 3 for the 3 forwards I put into the break zone through Kefka, 1 through the forward that Kefka breaks, and then 1 for Noctis breaking. And yeah, Xande chooses as many forwards as characters were put into the break zone, so that includes Noctis, includes the forwards your opponent breaks, so yeah, really, really useful. Ultimately, yeah, Noctis can play Regis onto the field to then replay things put onto the field. But if you haven't had forwards put into the break zone this turn or something like that, you do have other options, so something like Arden as well. Arden's actually quite a good card because he stops any forwards from attacking or blocking till the end of the next turn. So even though I believe you can only use Noctis on your turn, yeah, you can only use Noctis during turn, it does stop any troublesome forwards that might attack the following turn from attacking, as well as blocking as well. And then there's also Gladio as well, so there is the Gladiolus that he can play back onto the field. This Gladio's cost is also reduced by 3 if you control a card named Noctis. It doesn't have to be a forward, so this Gladio becomes only a 2 CP if you do control this Noctis as well, which is actually quite nice, because you want to be playing lots of cheap forwards in this deck to be able to fund the likes of Kefka if you need to. But yeah, Noctis has a few forwards. There's not a huge amount, but Noctis in the right situation, it's very nice to have him there, because being able to use his ability to then bring loads of things back or play troublesome forwards onto the field is very useful. Then we've got Edgar. Honestly, only in the deck because he is a king, which means he is searchable off of Claris. The only 6 forward that he can actually choose to give plus 2k, and when it attacks, choose a forward, deal 7k, is Kefka. I think, anyway, I don't believe there's any others. No, that I'm aware of. So yeah, Edgar, ultimately, you don't really care about his second effect. His first effect is nice if you have a forward that you want to attack that isn't quite big enough to attack, but ultimately, he is your Claris search target. Samurai. So Samurai has quite a few good targets here. Obviously, it's a 4 CP fire forward, so you can't bring any of your earth forwards out, so no getting the Gabranth forward, for example. But still, lots of good forwards. So Amadar is one. I'll talk more about him later. Garland, a good forward. Squall, probably the target it'll always be. Or Zande. So even if you break Samurai just to play Zande onto the field, you at least get to choose one forward and deal in 9k. Not the worst thing in the world. And then Kolka. So yeah, you play Kolka onto the field, you then discard a card, or discard a forward, sorry. You choose a forward, you deal that forward the damage equal to the power of the forward you discarded. There's quite a few high cost forwards in this deck, high power forwards. There are a few low power forwards, so it's something like Ewan, for example, or Kashi. But ultimately, most of the forwards are going to be around 7-8k. You have a few 9ks as well. But yeah, either way, you'll probably hopefully be killing something at least. But ultimately, another king target and another way to be able to hopefully kill something if you need to. Anyway, let's move on to the forwards. So I've already kind of gone over Kefka and what his utility is in this deck. And ultimately, it's to be able to actually get forwards into the break zone, so then they can be replayed off of Regis, or utilize Zande much better. But there's a few other weird combos as well that are actually quite funny, so I'll go over those cards now as well. So Amadar, firstly and foremost, Amadar's in this deck because actually monsters get played a lot these days. Just standard monsters, things like Atomos. So having Amadar immediately become a 10k first striker with Brave is pretty significant. Unfortunately, normally a lot of the cards that get played that are monsters will actually deal with Amadar. So for example, Tross. Yes, Amadar's massive and a problem until your opponent attacks with Tross and then bounces Amadar. But ultimately, it does mean that he is a kind of a homing beacon for that sort of thing, so they will always go for Amadar because he's massive, he's first strike, and he can keep on attacking. But either way, still quite fun forward. But when a forward you control is put from the field into the break zone, double the power of Amadar until the end of the turn. So if Amadar maybe can't push through because your opponent's got something like Daisy or, I don't know, just something else, making Amadar's power double with that potential first strike and Brave as well is pretty good. And then, yeah, so I'm still talking about how these forwards that utilize Kefka. So obviously you can put a forward into the break zone to play Kefka, and then that ultimately will double Amadar's power as well. Then there is Gutsco. Actually, I'm just going to work my way through the forwards and I'll talk about how they utilize them. So Nail, 33 forwards on the deck. Chances are Nail's going to hit. He can also put forwards or remove forwards from the game to then be able to hopefully kill something. If it's just a problematic forward, Nail is one of your main ways of just nuke something straight up. Or just make him bigger, give him haste to be able to push through as well is really, really nice. But he is mostly in the deck just to be able to get you more forwards to your hand to then hopefully either kill stuff on the field or fund your Kefka or whatever. Gabranth. So Gabranth's got a lot of search targets. He's an EX, but ultimately he can get you your Kefka. So playing Gabranth onto the field as either your second or third forward to then go search that Kefka, to then put those forwards into the break zone to play Kefka, to then break your Noctis, to play Regis, to then play things. You see where I'm going with this. There's lots of cool ongoing combos. Obviously, it only takes your opponent to interject at 1 point for this all to go awry, but again, Lail is important, making sure your opponent can't Amaterasu or something like that, or if they do, at least you can cancel it. So options for Gabranth are obviously Nail, Kefka. You've also got Regis as well, but you can also search him off of the Claris, so he may not be your first option. And Gladio as well. So if you've got Noctis on the field, maybe going for the Gladio to then play him on the field for cheap as well. Big forward, damage 3, also gains plus 1,000 power and Brave. Then Arden, already gone over his effect, but when Arden's put from the field into the break zone by your opponent's summons abilities, play Arden onto the field at the end of the turn. So that's not too bad. Now, obviously, that doesn't include damage or power loss. I don't believe it includes power loss only. Basically, things that are rule processes. So say, for example, your opponent casts a summon an Odin or a Tomos. Odin would read, choose a forward, break it, or a Tomos would be choose a forward, or your opponent selects a forward, put it into the break zone. Those two would trigger Arden's effect to return onto the field at the end of the turn. If your opponent played something along the lines of, is it Bismarck? I can't remember the name of the song now, but if they were to reduce Arden's power to 0, or if they were to deal Arden 9k damage, he wouldn't return onto the field at the end of the turn, because those are rule processes. They are just part of the game. Technically, yes, he is leaving the field because of an ability, but actually he's leaving the field because of the damage that the ability gave him, or reduces power because of what the ability gave him. You know what I mean. And because it's a rule process rather than the effect of the card being break him, put him into the break zone, he will not return through that. So that is one annoying factor of him. But ultimately, being able to come onto the field, make it so a forward cannot be broken. A forward can't attack or block for your turn and then your opponent's following turn. Not too bad. Regis, already gone over this. Now, obviously, you don't have any lightning, and you know, this is Earth, so you could definitely put some form of lightning generation in here. I haven't done, because I've already gone over it. I mean, you could sacrifice one of the other cards. You could probably get rid of Kolka or something like that. Maybe drop down the Noctis to only a 1-of, and then put things like Catchy or Tyro, obviously. But ultimately, because Regis is only a 1-of anyway, and he's really the only multicolour card in the deck, I didn't feel it worth it. I'd rather have more Noctis and play him off of that anyway, because, yeah, just how I'd prefer to do it. Garland. So this is one of the cards that you could probably remove from this deck. He's ultimately in here just because he's a good forward that stays on the field and is kind of hard to get rid of. But if you break your own backup, so if you do use something like Samurai or Noctis, you get a card. Again, similarly with Lael as well. I don't think I've got any other. Geomancer, you could break your Geomancer. You've got a lot of backups that you could break in this deck, and that does get you cards to hand. And that is really the reason that Garland's on. He's kind of sticky, hard to get rid of. You could use an S for him, but getting more cards to hand, which is more forwards, again, not too bad. Gutsko. So this is a fun little one. So when Gutsko leaves the field, you get to add all the cards that he's removed from the game to your hand, and that's when he enters and when he attacks as well. So even attacking with him, knowing you're going to die, you should be getting at least 2 cards to hand, unless of course your opponent has an Amaterasu, at which point you've got Lael there. Now ultimately, Lael, depending on how many cards Gutsko's got on him, Lael may not be used for that. It depends what cards Gutsko's revealed, and you would get to hand. You know, there's lots of different variables there to take into consideration, but ultimately Gutsko being put into the break zone through something like Kefka means that Gutsko enters the field, attacks, maybe gets a point of damage through, you then put him into the break zone, you get 2 cards to hand for putting Gutsko into the break zone for Kefka. That's not too shabby in my opinion. Miraga Fens. So again, probably one of the cards you might be able to take out of this deck. He's an EX, but the problem is it's when Miraga Fens enters the field, choose one forward, put into your break zone from the field this turn, add it to your hand. So you would have to have a forward already have died to then have Miraga Fens actually get that card back to hand. So you'd have to block first on an attack, and then Miraga Fens be the following EX. So if your opponent's only going to attack with one forward, it's a bit of a catch-22 because you block with the forward, it dies, but then there's no second attack for Miraga Fens to get him back. So he's not amazing, but he is really useful when you use him with something like Kefka or some other means of breaking your own forwards, because you put him into the break zone and it might be a really helpful forward. You then play Miraga Fens, get that forward back, replay him onto the field. Cat Shi. Reveals 2 cards off the top of your deck, so also an EX as well. 33 forwards, probably going to hit it. Also a really good option for the Kefka death as well. Just a really cheap forward that effectively replaces itself in your hand. Probably. It can miss, but it probably will hit. And yeah, just a nice cheap way to be able to fund your Kefka. Squall. Standard good Fire Legend as standard. I mean, what more is there to say? It's Squall, he deals 8k. Kind of hard to get your hand down to 0 sometimes. And even harder to get your opponent down to 0, so you need to be monitoring that. But you being in fire, running something like Samurai, your opponent will be watching your break zone like a hawk, so chances are that will be kind of tough to do. But if you can put your opponent in a position where you've got so many forwards there struggling to deal with it, they may have to start laying lots of forwards as well, at which point Squall then might be able to get his double attack off if your opponent forgets about that. Durando. So again, a pretty good card. He poses a problem for your opponent, because if he's there on the field and they know that if you attack with something like Geomancer, it then becomes a bit of a problem, because he'll be able to push through, get you 2 cards back to hand, you know, a backup and a forward, and that again is if you put forwards into the break zone through Kefka. I mean, you'll have forwards in the break zone anyway. There are 33 forwards, so there'll be lots of options there. And yeah, just a good way to be able to keep on getting more cards to hand and keep on playing more forwards and overwhelm your opponent. Ewan. So this is a funny one. He's not an amazing card. When Ewan's put from the field into the break zone, you may put Ewan on top of his owner's deck. It's fine, I guess. If he's bounced, it doesn't trigger though. But at damage 3, he has an EX burst. When he's put from the, into the damage zone, choose him forward, break it. This ability will only be used as an EX burst. So it's not like you can play him at damage 3 and then kill something when he enters the field. He has to go to the damage zone. But if you put him into the break zone through Kefka's effect, then he is then put on top of your deck, which is actually kind of funny. So it's a nice way to be able to actually kind of recur him, I guess. And ultimately, I have hit him a couple of times as an EX, so I don't think it's the worst thing in the world to have him in there. Now, you just need to be mindful of the fact that if he keeps on going to the top of your deck, you are slowing your draws down, and if you are dead drawing and your opponent's starting to overwhelm you, then actually Ewan may not be the best choice in the world. So yeah, you might be able to remove him from the game, but ultimately I put him in there as a funny aside for Kefka's effect. Daisy, you got a buttload of forwards, you want to make sure to protect them from damage. Daisy's your answer. Being able to make it so that she's got S's online is always nice. Now, this might be a case for saying maybe you should put some summons in here, make it so Daisy cannot be broken, or some other effects, just so basically you have another means of protecting Daisy, because in reality, she isn't that hard to kill. Yes, she can have a huge power, but if your opponent's in lightning or something like that, and they're just like, break Daisy, she's dead. What do you do about it? So, yeah, she is a really, really useful forward in the right decks, but ultimately she isn't the hardest to kill either. Xande, yeah, so as I said before, there's loads of different ways of getting forwards from the break zone, or Kefka is the way you get your forwards into the break zone. You then play Xande onto the field, kill stuff. It's also quite funny though, if your opponent forgets about Xande, you attack with him, they block, he goes into the break zone, you then remove all your breaks, remove all your backups, you obviously have to pay the fire and earth, play Xande back onto the field, deal 9k to 5 characters, or 5 forwards your opponent controls. Not too shabby. Barsh, again, standard fire earth legend is good. Be able to take a point of damage, hopefully push you to 3, so then you start triggering more effects like Ewan or Barsh's effect. But then ultimately searches you a fire earth card. And it could be a lot of, you know, there's so many different cards that you could search in this deck, but ultimately it can get you your Kefka to then hopefully fund the break and kill more things with Xande. It could be the Regis, it could be the Noctis, it could be the Claris. There's so many good options in the deck ultimately. But having a card this versatile to be able to find your answer is ultimately why it's in the deck. And finally, Gladio. Already gone over it, nothing special. He can become a 2 CP if you've got the Noctis back up on the field. If you don't, then he isn't amazing, and I have had to hardcast him a couple of times before. But damage 3, he becomes a 10k with Brave. Again, that's not too bad, it's not amazing either. But I think he's worth it. You could probably drop him down to a 1-off and put something else in his place as well. But he is ultimately pretty good if you play him off of 2 CP, especially if you're playing him to then play the Kefka. Now, it's worth noting in this deck, there's lots of forwards in the deck which are there, and you then put them into the break zone to then play Kefka onto the field. Now, let's say you're playing Cat Shi, or Ewan, or Gladio, or just something else, you know, what's his name, Gabranth onto the field, and then you're putting him in the break zone to play Kefka. If you had Kefka in hand already, actually paying the 8 CP for Kefka might be a bit more worth it. But the idea is to capitalize on that, obviously. If you don't have a means of capitalizing on putting those forwards into the break zone, then it was kind of pointless. So you might as well have just discarded Cat Shi and Ewan to then play Kefka, because those forwards are in the break zone, but you've paid more because you've had to dial a backup, and then that forward goes into the break zone. It depends, though, ultimately how much you're paying for these cards as well. Like, if you are playing Ewan and Cat Shi onto the field, if Cat Shi is getting you a card to hand, and then you've already had a couple of forwards on the field already that you're struggling to do anything with, maybe putting them into the break zone is worth it for Kefka. But ultimately, you've still paid CP for those, and, you know, even playing Cat Shi onto the field, that's 1 backup and Cat Shi out of your hand, not guaranteed to hit. You're likely to, but not guaranteed. So you do have to weigh up the odds sometimes. Playing those cards onto the field to then put them into the break zone to play Kefka, if you're not doing anything more than that, probably not worth it. You want to be able to then play Xande, or then break Noctis to play Regis to then play more things. You could probably add more Regis into the deck to utilize this more, and then add more multicolor. That's definitely a route you could go down. But I wanted to make sure that there are just a bigger variety of forwards in this deck. Things that are either hard to get rid of, decent to be used with something like Kolka, or just good standard forwards that are there posing a problem. As I mentioned before, you probably could get rid of something like Muraga Fens, maybe Ewan, but they were just fun cards that I wanted to test out and actually did work in some cases. So yeah, sometimes using something like Muraga Fens as well, because it's not a heavily played card, actually benefits you, because if you attack with something your opponent expects they then block, and then you play Muraga Fens to then get something like, you know, Sith back, play onto the field, Catchy, sorry, whatever. You know, there's a variety of different ways that you can utilize it just to be able to re-trigger certain entry effects. But yeah, let me know how you guys would change this deck. I mean, I guess the obvious changes: put more summons in the deck, maybe utilize monsters a bit more, using something like Mirror to then bring a monster back onto the field when you've got a higher damage, because monsters can be put into the break zone as well for Kafka, but then you will struggle to utilize something like Regis more, so that is ultimately why I went with so many forwards. But yeah, adding even maybe a couple of Amaterasu into the field, Mist Dragon, ways of protecting your Daisy, there's a few different ways you could take it, but I'd wanted to go for a heavy forward deck with some decent backup consistency, with some fun effects. Anyway, yeah, like I said, let me know how you guys would change it, what you might put in, what you might take out. And yeah, put them in the comments below. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, guys. Stay safe, be lucky, and I'll see you in the next video.